The small room was dark. The air smelled of rust and damp cloth. In the corner sat a young alien girl, her knees pulled to her chest, her thin arms wrapped tightly around them. She had been here for hours, maybe longer. She had stopped counting. Every sound outside made her heart jump. Every shadow made her think someone had come to hurt her again. She had grown up hearing terrible stories about humans, that they were dangerous, that they took what they wanted and crushed anyone who stood in their way. In her mind, they were monsters in strange skin, creatures that could smile while doing terrible things. Now one was standing right in front of her cell door. The metal door opened with a slow, heavy creak. Lights spilled into the room. And there he was, tall, broad shoulders, his shadow filling the doorway. He stepped inside without rushing, his boots making a soft sound on the floor. His face was unreadable, his eyes steady and calm, but that calmness only made her more uneasy. She pressed herself back into the wall, wishing she could vanish into it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He looked at her, not with hunger or anger, but with something she couldn't name. His eyes seemed to study her as if he was trying to understand. But she didn't trust that. She had been looked at before, by people who pretended to care and then hurt her. Her breathing was quick. Her fingers clutched the fabric of her worn clothes. She thought of running, but there was nowhere to run. 2. The room had one door, and he was standing in it. She wondered if this was the moment her life would end. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and fast. He moved, and she flinched, her body tensing like a trapped animal. But he didn't grab her. Instead, he reached into the bag on his shoulder and pulled something out. It was a blanket, warm-looking, soft. He walked closer, his steps slow, and placed it on the floor in front of her, not touching her, not forcing her to take it. Then he placed a small bottle of water beside it. She stared at the items, not believing this was all he meant to do. Her eyes darted up to his face, searching for the trick, the moment when he would demand something in return. But he didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment, and then finally said, "You're safe here." Safe. The word felt strange to her, like it didn't belong in her world. She didn't answer. She only pulled the blanket toward her, slowly. Watching his every move, he didn't step forward again. Instead, he turned and walked back to the door, his figure becoming a shadow once more. And then he was gone. The door closed gently, not slammed. She sat there for a long time, holding the blanket. It was warmer than she expected. It smelled faintly of metal and something clean. Maybe his home, maybe him. She didn't understand why he had given it to her. People didn't give without taking. That was the rule of survival she had always known. The minutes passed. She drank from the water bottle in small sips, still suspicious, still tense, but a little less cold. She listened for his return, for footsteps. But the place was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines somewhere far away. Her thoughts were restless. Was he a traitor who had bought her? Was he keeping her for some reason she didn't yet know? Or was he different from the one she had known before? Her mind told her not to trust, but her body, wrapped in the blanket, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, comfort. Next time she heard the door open, she tensed again. But this time he didn't enter. He only placed a small tray of food inside. Bread, a bit of fruit, and something warm in a cup. He left without saying a word, without even looking at her. It was confusing, frustrating even, because she couldn't read him, couldn't predict him, as the night came. She lay on the blanket, not sleeping fully, just resting with her eyes closed. She heard distant movements, the sound of him walking somewhere in the building. Tools clinking, maybe fixing something. She wondered why he didn't lock the door. Why he didn't shout or demand. She thought again of his face when he first saw her, calm, steady, almost gentle. But that couldn't be right. Humans weren't gentle. At least, not in the stories she knew. Maybe he was pretending. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. She decided she would stay ready. Keep her guard up, yet even as she told herself to be careful. She found her breathing slowly matching the rhythm of his steps in the distance. And when sleep finally came, it was lighter than before, but it came. This was the first sight. The first moment where fear and confusion met something new. Something she couldn't yet name, but that would change everything. The next morning came quietly. The pale light of dawn slipped through the small gap in the wall. She woke to the faint sound of metal tools clicking somewhere outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the blanket around her reminded her. It wasn't hers. It was his, the human's, the one who had stepped into the room last night. And left without touching her, she sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The door was closed, but not locked. She stared at it for a long time, wondering if she should try to leave, but something in her chest told her not to. She didn't know if it was fear or something else. Not long after, the door opened, she stiffened, but this time his steps were slower, quieter. He was holding something in his hands, a small wooden tray with steam rising from it. The smell reached her before he did. Warm bread and some kind of soup. Her stomach tightened painfully, reminding her she hadn't eaten properly in days. He placed the tray near her, but didn't try to hand it to her directly. His movements were careful, almost like he didn't want to scare her. "It's fresh," he said simply. His voice was calm, low, without any demand in it. She stared at the food, then at him, waiting for the trick, waiting for the price. When she didn't move, he stepped back, as if giving her space. "Eat when you're ready," he said, then turned toward the door again. She noticed he always kept his back partly turned when close to her, as if making sure she never felt cornered. Her hands moved slowly toward the bread. It was still warm, soft inside, but with a thin crust. She took a small bite, chewing carefully. It tasted better than anything she'd had in months. The soup was light but full of flavor. Each spoonful warmed her chest. She kept glancing at the door, wondering if he was watching. But he didn't come back. Later, she heard him outside, talking to someone. His voice firm but not raised. The words were muffled, but she caught a few. "No. She's not for sale, and she's staying here." The rest was lost under the hum of machines. She froze, her mind spinning. He wasn't going to trade her, at least not yet. But why? When he returned in the afternoon, he was carrying something else, a small box with compartments. Inside were bandages, salves, and other supplies. Without asking, he crouched down a short distance from her and opened the box. "Your hands," he said. She shook her head quickly, pulling them close to her chest. He didn't force her, didn't move closer. He simply set the box on the floor and stood. "If you change your mind, it's here." Then he left again, his steps fading down the hall. She stared at the open box for a long time, her mind unsure what to make of it. As evening came, she found herself listening for his movements, the way he walked, the sound of tools tapping against metal, sometimes a soft sigh as he worked. There was no shouting, no threats, no cruel laughter, only quiet and the steady rhythm of his routine. At one point, the door opened again, but instead of him, a small metallic drone rolled inside, carrying another folded blanket. It stopped near her, dropped the blanket gently, then rolled out. She looked at it in surprise, wondering if he had sent it so she wouldn't be startled by him. She unfolded the blanket, this one thicker, smelling faintly of soap. She wrapped it around herself and felt a strange pull inside, a mix of confusion and something warmer. She didn't know the word for it. Maybe relief, maybe trust. That night, as the building settled into silence, she lay on the two blankets, feeling more comfortable than she had in a long time. She thought about the human's face, his voice, the way he didn't push her, didn't demand. It didn't fit any story she'd been told. Some part of her wanted to ask him why he was doing this. But the words stayed locked inside her. Trust wasn't something she could give easily. And yet, she was beginning to wonder if he was trying to earn it. She closed her eyes. The quiet hum of machines in the background. The faint memory of his voice, saying, "You're safe here," still in her mind. She told herself not to believe it. But somewhere deep down, a small part of her already did. The days began to pass in a strange kind of silence. The alien girl stayed in the small room most of the time, but the door was never locked. She noticed that every morning, without fail, a tray of food would be placed near the doorway. Sometimes by the human himself, sometimes by the small metallic drone that hummed softly as it rolled in. At first, she thought it was a trick. Maybe he wanted her to lower her guard before he showed his true self. But as the days went on, nothing changed. He never took the food away if she didn't eat right away. He never shouted, never demanded. His presence was quiet but steady when she peeked out into the hallway. She would see him working, his hands busy repairing strange machines, polishing tools, or sorting metal parts. He always noticed her, but never rushed toward her. Instead, he would give a small nod, almost like a silent greeting, then continue with his work. She began to watch him from a distance, trying to understand him. He was strong. That much was clear from the way he lifted heavy panels with ease. But his strength was not wild or cruel. It was controlled, his movements careful, even when dealing with stubborn machinery. Sometimes she would hear him humming under his breath while he worked, a low, steady tune she didn't recognize. It was nothing like the harsh voices she was used to. The sound made the air feel softer somehow, safer. She didn't know why it mattered. But she kept listening. One afternoon, she found herself standing in the doorway longer than usual, watching him repair a large piece of equipment. He glanced up at her, then pointed toward a smaller set of tools on the table. "Pass me that wrench," he said, his tone even. Not commanding, after a moment of hesitation, she stepped forward, picked it up, and placed it in his hand. He gave a short thanks and went back to work, as if it was nothing, but for her, it was something. She had never been asked for help without a threat or a trap behind it. The moment stayed with her longer than she expected. The next day, she stood closer while he worked. Curious about the machines, she asked one question, her voice quiet. "What is that?" He looked up, a little surprised, then explained simply, "It's a power converter, keeps the lights on." She nodded, not fully understanding, but liking that he had answered without hesitation. Over time, the quiet between them began to feel different. It wasn't heavy with fear anymore. It was almost peaceful. She found herself leaving her room more often, sitting on a small crate in the corner of the workshop while he worked. Sometimes she would hand him tools. Other times she would just watch. He never pried into her past, never asked where she had come from or what had happened to her. At first, she thought that meant he didn't care. But now she wondered if it meant he respected her silence. She wasn't ready to speak about it. And maybe he knew that. One evening, she was carrying a small container of parts toward his workbench when she tripped. The pieces spilled across the floor. She froze, waiting for anger, waiting for the shout. But it never came. Instead, he crouched down beside her, picking up the parts and handing them back to her one by one. "No harm done," he said, with a faint smile. She felt her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand. That night, she sat in her room, the blankets around her, thinking about the days they had spent in this quiet rhythm. No shouting, no chains, no fear that he would turn suddenly violent. It was still strange, but slowly she began to accept it. There were still moments when fear crept in, a sudden noise outside, the echo of boots in the hallway, and she would tense, ready to run. But every time, it was only him returning from some task. carrying more supplies or wiping grease from his hands. On the 7th day since she had first seen him, she realized something. The sound of his footsteps no longer made her flinch. Instead, it made her shoulders loosen, as if her body already knew she was safe. Even if her mind hadn't fully caught up, she didn't know what he wanted from her, if he wanted anything at all. But for now, in these quiet days, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. The slow, cautious beginnings of trust. The day had been calm, the air outside still and heavy. But as the sun began to fall behind the jagged hills, dark clouds rolled across the sky. The alien girl sat in her corner of the workshop, sorting small bolts into a container while the human worked at his bench. Neither spoke much. Only the soft clink of metal and the hum of a nearby generator filled the space. By the time night arrived, the first rumbles of thunder echoed in the distance. She froze for a moment, the sound pulling at memories she didn't want to remember. Memories of nights when storms didn't just bring rain, but fire from the sky, raids and shouts. She glanced toward the door, her hands trembling slightly. The human noticed, his eyes flicking to her before returning to the machine in front of him. "Storm's coming," he said simply. "Best stay inside." She gave a small nod but said nothing. An hour later, the storm hit with full force. Rain hammered against the roof. Wind howled through the cracks in the old building. And lightning flashed so bright it lit the entire room for a heartbeat. The thunder followed almost instantly, shaking the walls. She curled tighter into herself, her breath uneven. The sound of the storm was too close to the chaos she once knew. Every crash of thunder felt like an explosion. Every flash of light felt like danger rushing toward her. The human set down his tools. Wiping his hands on a rag, he walked toward her slowly, not rushing, his boots making steady, calm steps. She tensed, unsure of what he meant to do. Without a word, he sat down beside her, close, but not touching. The blankets she had been using were wrapped tightly around her shoulders. But she was still shivering. Another flash of lightning made her flinch, and that's when he moved. He reached out gently, pulling the blankets more snug around her. Then he placed one strong arm around her shoulders, not trapping her, just holding her steady. His body was warm, solid, unmoving. He was like a wall between her and the storm. She wanted to pull away at first, her mind screaming that this was too close, too dangerous. But the longer she sat there, the more she realized he wasn't forcing her to stay. If she wanted to move, she could, and that choice, that freedom, made it different. Another clap of thunder shook the building. She pressed herself instinctively closer to him, her head brushing against his chest. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was so different from the storm outside. Calm, strong, unshaken. He didn't speak, didn't tell her to stop being afraid, didn't mock her for trembling. He simply stayed there, letting her decide when to move. The storm raged for hours, but in that corner, wrapped in his warmth, the fear began to ease. At one point, she found herself breathing in sync with him, the rise and fall of his chest guiding her own breaths. Her body began to loosen, the tightness in her shoulders fading little by little. She had never been this close to a human before, and yet it didn't feel like prey. She felt protected. She didn't know when her eyes began to close, the sounds of the storm slowly blending into the steady beat of his heart. She drifted into a light sleep, still leaning against him, still wrapped in the blankets he had given her. When she woke, the storm had passed. The air was cool and clean, and faint light was coming through the windows. She realized she was still leaning on him, his arms still loosely around her shoulders, as if he had stayed like that the entire night. She sat up slowly, unsure if she should say something, but he only gave a small nod and stood, walking back to his workbench as if nothing unusual had happened. That morning, she felt different. She didn't know if it was because the storm had ended or because of the way he had stayed with her through it. But the space between them felt smaller now, not as wide and cold as before. She told herself it didn't mean she trusted him yet, not fully. But she couldn't deny that the fear she once felt when looking at him was no longer as sharp. It was softer now, replaced by something she couldn't yet name. The storm had left the world outside washed clean. The sky was a pale blue, and the air smelled fresh. The alien girl stepped outside for the first time since she had arrived. Not far, just to the edge of the doorway, the human was already outside, checking the roof for damage. His movements were steady and practical. Like someone who had done this many times before, she watched him from the doorway, the light catching in her eyes. He glanced at her, but didn't call her over. Instead, he went on with his work, tightening bolts and replacing a few loose panels. There was no rush, no sharp orders. Just the quiet sound of tools clicking against metal. When he came back inside, she was still there. Holding onto the doorframe. "Roof's fine now," he said, his voice carrying no expectation for her to respond. Yet, for the first time, she did. Good. The word was soft, almost unsure. But it made his eyes shift toward her with a brief flicker of something, maybe surprise, maybe approval. That day, she found herself spending more time in the main workshop instead of her small room. She sat on the same crate she had before, watching him repair a heavy generator. After a while, he pointed toward a small set of wires and said, "Hold that steady for me." She hesitated for a second, but then moved forward, her hands holding the wires in place while he worked. The work was quiet. Only the soft hum of the generator and the occasional clink of a tool breaking. The silence, when they finished, he nodded at her, "Thanks." The word was simple, but it felt heavier than it sounded. It was the first time she had helped him without fear pulling at her chest. In the days that followed, he began to involve her more. Sometimes asking her to pass him a wrench, other times letting her test the lights after he fixed them. She began learning the names of tools, the way certain machines sounded when they were working right. It was small, but it made her feel useful. One evening, she noticed a cut on his arm, nothing deep, but enough to leave a thin line of red. Without thinking, she pointed at it. "You should clean that," she said quietly. He looked down at it as if he hadn't noticed. "Guess you're right," he replied, his tone calm. And he let her hand him a small cloth from the medkit. It wasn't just the work that changed between them. It was the way the silence felt. Before, it had been heavy, full of unspoken fear. Now, it was lighter, almost comfortable. She didn't feel the need to watch his every move like a predator might. Instead, she found herself listening to the sound of his voice when he explained something, noticing how it stayed steady no matter what he was saying. One night, they ate at the same table for the first time. Not across the room from each other, not in separate corners, but at the same table. The meal was simple: bread, dried meat, and warm tea. She didn't talk much, but when she glanced up, he wasn't staring at her or trying to read her thoughts. He was just eating, like sharing a table was normal. That small normality began to settle into her chest. Each day, the fear seemed to take a step backward, making room for something else, something warmer. The change became even clearer when a loud crash came from outside one afternoon. A supply crate had fallen from a small delivery drone, and for a second, the noise made her tense, her body ready to run. But then she heard his voice, steady and close. "It's fine," he said. "Just a crate." And somehow, that was enough to stop her from running. By the end of the week, she had begun to sleep more soundly, still wrapping herself in the blankets he had given her. But now, without keeping one eye open, she still didn't know exactly why he was helping her, but she knew this. In this place, with him, she felt more at ease than she had in years. And though she didn't say it aloud, a thought began to take root in her mind. A quiet truth she couldn't ignore anymore. She was beginning to trust him. The days of quiet work and slow trust did not last forever. Danger always had a way of finding its way back. It began on a late afternoon. When the light outside was starting to fade into the deep orange of evening, the alien girl was in the workshop, helping the humans sort through a pile of spare parts. The sound came first, the low rumble of engines in the distance. It grew. Louder, deeper, until the walls themselves seemed to catch the vibration. The human froze mid-movement, his eyes narrowing slightly. She noticed the shift in his expression, and a chill went through her. He set the parts aside and moved toward the window, glancing out just enough to see without being seen. "Stay here," he said, in a low voice. It was not loud, but there was something in it that made her obey instantly. He walked to a hidden compartment near the wall and pulled out a long weapon, the kind she had seen in the hands of soldiers. The rumble grew closer until it became clear several raider vehicles were approaching, their rough engines coughing black smoke into the air. She recognized the insignia painted on their sides. Her stomach dropped. It was the same group that had once taken her, the same faces that had thrown her into cages like an animal. Her heart began to pound, memories flooding back. She stepped backward, almost stumbling over a crate. Her eyes locked. On the human part of her wanted to run, to hide in the smallest, darkest corner she could find. But another part didn't want to leave him. The raiders stopped just outside. The heavy thud of boots followed, voices shouting, laughing. The sound of people who thought they owned everything they touched. A tall, scarred alien with sharp eyes called out, "We know you're in there. Human, open up." The human didn't open the door. Instead, he moved closer to it, standing tall, his weapon held but not raised. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone firm, controlled. "Supplies," the leader replied. "Food, tools, and whatever else you've got, and we know you've got company in there. We saw her tracks." The alien girl's chest tightened. They were talking about her. She took a step back, but the human's voice cut through her panic. "She's not yours," he said simply, the words like steel. The raiders laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Everything is ours if we want it," the leader replied. The human's expression didn't change, but his stance shifted slightly, his voice still calm. "Leave now, and you walk away." There was no bluff in his tone. For a tense moment, the air outside went still. The raiders whispered among themselves, and then one stepped forward, trying to push the door. That was when the human moved. The sound of his weapon charging filled the space. Sharp and electric, the intruder froze. "You step inside. You don't leave," the human said, the weight of his words pressing into the air. Even from where she stood, the alien girl felt the truth in them. The leader spat on the ground, muttered something under his breath, and then signaled for his men to retreat. The engines roared again as they pulled away, the sound fading into the distance until the only noise left was the hum of the workshop's generator. The human lowered his weapon and placed it back in the hidden compartment. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, making sure she was unharmed. "They won't be back soon," he finally said. She didn't know what to say. Her hands were trembling. But it wasn't just from fear anymore. It was from the weight of what had just happened. He had stood between her and the danger she had run from all her life, and he hadn't hesitated. Later that night, as they sat at the small table, she found herself staring at him, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to understand. He could have handed her over. It would have been easier, safer for him, but he hadn't. When he noticed her gaze, he raised an eyebrow slightly. "What?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing," she replied. But deep inside, it wasn't nothing at all. It was the moment she knew that her trust in him was no longer just growing. It had roots now. The night after the raiders came was unusually quiet. Outside, the air was still, and the stars hung low and bright over the hills. Inside the workshop, the hum of the generator was steady, but everything else felt calm. The alien girl sat in her corner at first, wrapped in the 2 blankets he had given her. But her thoughts kept returning to what had happened earlier. She could still see it in her mind, him standing in the doorway, weapon in hand, facing the raiders without fear. She could still hear his voice when he said, "She's not yours." The words had been like a shield. They had wrapped around her as surely as his arm had on the night of the storm. For so long, she had learned to survive by staying far from others, by keeping her distance, by never letting herself need anyone. Yet, here she was, sitting in his home, her heart pulling her toward the one person she had once feared most. The human was sitting at his workbench, repairing a small drone. His movements slow, almost absent-minded, as if he was letting his thoughts drift while his hands worked. Every so often, he would glance toward her, not to check on her like she was a prisoner, but as if to make sure she was still there. As the night grew later, she realized she didn't want to be in her corner anymore. She rose quietly, her bare feet making almost no sound on the floor. He noticed her movement, but didn't speak, just watched as she came closer. When she stopped near him, she hesitated, unsure how to ask for what she wanted. He set down his tools and leaned back slightly. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "Not in there," she murmured, her voice almost too soft to hear. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he nodded toward the cot in the corner of the main room. She crossed the space slowly, her eyes darting toward him as if checking for permission. When she reached the cot, he had already sat down on it. Pulling the blanket from his shoulders and laying back, she stood there for a few seconds, then climbed onto the cot beside him, the movement small and careful. At first, she stayed at the edge, her body tense, but then he shifted slightly, leaving space for her. Without thinking too hard about it, she moved closer, until her head rested lightly against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, slow and steady, the sound filling her ears. For a moment, she was afraid he might pull away. But he didn't. Instead, one arm came around her, loose but present, not trapping her, not holding her down, just there, solid and warm. She lay still, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the steady thump of his heart. 'Twas unlike anything she had known before. This closeness wasn't forced. It wasn't dangerous. It was safe, in a way she had never imagined a human could be. The quiet stretched on, her eyes growing heavier with each passing minute. The tension that had lived in her muscles for so long finally beginning to fade. Outside, the world could still be cruel, still be full of danger. But here, in this small space, she felt something she had never truly felt before. Home. He didn't speak, didn't ask why she had come to him. He simply let her rest there, his breathing a steady anchor in the dark. When her eyes finally closed, it was without the usual fear that something would wake her in panic. Instead, she drifted into sleep easily, her ear pressed against the sound of the one thing she trusted. Now more than anything, his heartbeat. The human stayed awake a while longer, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, his thoughts his own. But when he glanced down and saw her asleep, a faint smile touched his lips. He adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, making sure she was warm, then closed his own eyes. That night, no storms, no raiders, no fear reached them, only the quiet, only the warmth and the unspoken truth that something had changed forever. The girl who had once been terrified of him now slept on his chest. And neither of them would ever forget how far they had come to reach this moment.